Welcome to the Generis Show, your unique perspective on everything you need to know about your civil rights and the criminal injustice system. With Erica Merrill, I'm attorney Brian Jones, criminal defense and civil rights warrior. Today in segment one, we'll be exploring the record increase in drug overdoses in the year 2020, the results of Tiger King Joe Exotic's criminal defense appeal, and the rejection of the insanity defense by a jury in the trial of the Capital Gazette shooters. In segment two, as promised, we'll be exploring the exclusionary rule and how it relates to the Fourth Amendment and your civil rights under the United States Constitution. To make sure you don't miss an episode, subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Look to the law office of brianjones.com and all of our social media outlets for everything you need to know about your civil rights and the criminal injustice system. So, Erica, did you see in the news this week, the CDC reported the 2020 death results from drug overdoses, and it's not good.
You know what, Brian? I saw that, and I feel like everyone could see this coming with the increase in depression from the pandemic last year and people not being able to see their loved ones for such a long time. It's just very lonely out there, and there are things that people are turning to, and unfortunately, drugs is one of them. Can you tell us a little bit about what the data recently released by the CDC tells us?
Overdose deaths rose by nearly 30% in 2020, hitting the highest number ever. More than 93,000 people died from drug overdoses in 2020. The primary substances were synthetic opioids. Fentanyl is a huge problem still. Psychostimulants such as methamphetamine, cocaine, and other semi-synthetic drugs like prescription medication that was being abused.
Wow, I feel like I can see where this is going because we've certainly done a lot of shows on the effects of drugs and crime in the past. And, why don't you remind us, why is this a significant issue for the world of criminal defense?
Well, it's a huge impact primarily on marginalized populations. Those people that are at the highest risk for drug abuse and addiction, whether that's inmates, rural populations, the LGBTQ community, or those living in poverty. Increases in theft charges, increases in probation violations are all resulting from reduced services, both in a treatment and a court-based supervision venue. People are waiting months to get a bed, even though it's court-ordered treatment. Oftentimes, people are having to be sent out of state to get their treatment. The combination of the pandemic closures, the relaxation of the supervision of those who are on court-ordered supervision resulted in a loss of rehabilitation progress for countless people who lost their personal community through meetings, drug court programs, and in-person check-ins. That's really critical to maintaining sobriety. Erica, we who deal with people who are in crisis on a regular basis often have to talk to them about not changing your location, but changing your circle. And that circle of friends is so important. That circle of support. And when that is just removed without prior warning and without supplementing it with something else, and the world just wasn't ready to go virtual in March of 2020, it created crisis for people who are struggling with addiction.
And it's such a sad story. I grieve for those who lost loved ones because of these addictions and these overdoses. And, really there not being a ton you could do back there in March of 2020, because as you said, the world wasn't ready for it. But what can we do now? Is there anything that an average person can do to help those that are in need of addiction services?
Vote, advocate, and support. Vote to fund rehabilitation facilities. Vote to increase funding for addiction services. Vote to expand healthcare coverage so that people who are in need aren't denied a bed because they don't have the right insurance plan or they have no insurance whatsoever. Advocate in your community. Go to your local mental health board. Distribute their free materials. Every single local mental health board has free pamphlets that you can spread in community boards, in restrooms, and in common areas of the places that you go every week. Go to your local police and fire departments because they have free Narcan trainings and can teach you how to support somebody who's in recovery, and then give that support. Addiction isn't a symptom of poverty. It's not a symptom of a race. It's a disease that crosses all economic and social strata. And in that regard, there are programs that cater to all kinds of groups. You can find a sober fly fishing group in your community. You can go to Midnight Narcotics Anonymous meetings. You can donate to these programs. Find a program that aligns with your values and contribute your time and resources to help that organization serve the people who need it the most.
Great advice, Brian. And I do hope that when people are looking for something to do to help change the community for the better, that they take your advice, because it's obviously a crisis, and a 30% increase is just unheard of. It's unbelievable. And it's obviously something we need to focus on right away.
Well, absolutely. It's been a crisis in America for several decades, and it came to an abrupt and disturbing head in 2020. Let's hope that with all of the social change that we are experiencing right now, addiction services is one of the boats that this rising tide lifts up. Did you see in the news this week, Erica, that the United States Appeals Court has ordered a resentencing for Joe Exotic?
Yes, I did. And how amazing is it that he's getting a resentencing hearing? I mean, I didn't finish the show, so I didn't see all those circumstances. But can you tell us why this was even charged in federal court?
Joe Exotic was charged in federal court for two reasons. First, the alleged murder for hire plot involved using interstate commerce. In other words, the telephone lines and a computer. Now, because that alleged crime crossed state lines, the federal courts have jurisdiction for that alleged murder for hire plot. Second, the totality of his indictment included a variety of charges of federal animal abuse, violations of the Lacey Act, which prohibits the illegal trade in wildlife, and 9 violations of the Endangered Species Act, which specifically protects tigers. Now, of course, both Florida and Oklahoma could have charged him criminally as well on the same or related charges. But in this case, the federal court had jurisdiction, and of course, federal consequences are often significantly higher than their state counterparts. So I think this was a conscious decision by the authorities to try and maximize the penalties imposed upon Joe Exotic.
It's an interesting point that you just made. Like, why would a court be able to vacate a sentence, but then affirm a conviction? It seems like that's kind of a push-pull situation.
Yeah, so the court took an issue with how the sentencing guidelines and decisions in his case were applied. So at the point of conviction, there's kind of a bulwark in the criminal justice process. So at that point, once the guilty finding has been made, the court can review everything that led up to that and say, is this guilty finding supportable based on the law? Is this supportable based on the facts? And then there's a stopping point. And then the case goes on into the sentencing phase. And so in this case, the Court of Appeals took issue with how the sentencing phase went. So there wasn't any problems with the conviction itself, but rather just the sentencing portion of it. Appeals address all stages of a criminal case: pretrial litigation, so like motions to suppress and requests to exclude or admit evidence; the trial phase, the guilt phase, whether that's a bench or a jury trial, and determining whether the allegations made by the government are true or not true; and the sentencing phase, the part where the judge imposes or tells the convicted defendant what his consequences will be. And in this case, the sentencing judge didn't group two of the murder for hire charges, thinking they were not part of the same course of conduct. In other words, they weren't part of the same behavior. And he gave Joe Exotic two separate sentences for those charges. But the Court of Appeals said, no, 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 this is the same behavior. And so you can only be punished one time, double jeopardy, right? You can only suffer one consequence for a particular act if it results in a conviction for the same kind of offense. Now, in this case, the sentencing judge has to issue a new sentence that groups those charges according to the law and impose a new sentence on Joe Exotic.
I mean, that makes a lot of sense now that you've described it. I mean, it's true. I guess you can't be punished for the same crime twice. And I'm glad that they were able to show some justice there, even though, you know, some of the things he did were completely horrible. I'm a huge animal lover, and of course the attempted murder was terrible too. So are there any appeals left in this Joe Exotic case?
The Court of Appeals decision can be appealed up to the United States Supreme Court. Joe Exotic can wait until he is resentenced. He can appeal the new sentence that's imposed on him, depending on whether it does or doesn't conform with the applicable law and sentencing guidelines. And he can also continue to lay groundwork for a habeas corpus petition, a collateral attack, if you will, on the conviction itself. So he's got a variety of legal avenues available to him. We'll keep watching this case to see how it develops.
Well, thank you so much. I can't wait to hear what some of the updates are and if he does in fact appeal this.
Absolutely. And in a case that is just reaching its conclusion, Erica, did you see that the jury found Capital Gazette gunman Jared Ramos responsible and rejected his mental illness plea?
Well, yeah, I did. And I know it was a couple of years ago. If you don't mind just reminding us of what the circumstances were, because it just seems like there are so many terrible stories out there that we cover.
Yeah, so Jared Ramos had a vendetta against the Capital Gazette in Annapolis, Maryland. And he had a perception that they had slighted him, and he was ultimately charged with 23 counts in state court, including 5 counts of first-degree murder. This tragic mass shooting occurred in 2018 when he walked into the newsroom there in Annapolis, barricaded the exits, and opened fire. There were 5 deaths as the result of his actions.
So why is there a trial if the accused already pled guilty to 23 charges?
So this is an interesting thing about Maryland law. In Maryland, you don't plead not guilty by reason of insanity. You plead guilty, but not criminally liable due to your mental illness. So it's a little bit different than what we typically think of. We typically think of a defendant going in and saying, I'm not guilty of this because of my mental illness or disability. But in Maryland, you plead guilty and say, you can't punish me for this because of my mental illness. It's an interesting distinction in the law there. Now, the trial is therefore just a sentencing phase trial where the jury decides if Ramos can be held responsible for his actions or whether his mental illness makes it so that he can't be held responsible. Therefore, they decide whether he does time in a mental institution or a prison, because it's not a question of whether he did it or not. It's a question of how should he be punished.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, we've talked about mental illness quite a bit. And, you know, if somebody is charged with a crime and it is because of a mental illness, one would hope that they are going to get the right medical treatment so that, you know, while they're serving their sentence, they're able to also improve and be a better member of society if in fact they're able to get out and be a member of society again. So I'm wondering, I mean, probably he's not going to be let out again, but will Ramos receive mental health treatment in prison?
Not to the level that he would in a mental institution. A mental institution is designed to control and rehabilitate mental illness. Prison is designed to punish. So in this situation, he won't receive probably what is the necessary level of mental health care that he needs to become reintegrated into society. I think at some point it's possible that he could get out, although it's not likely. Now, this decision is unfortunately lawful and appropriate because the jury decided he wasn't insane at the time he committed the offense. And even though he presented evidence of severe mental illness, including delusional disorder and a disturbing history of stalking behavior as the result of his mental illnesses, the jury just said, no, we're going to hold you responsible for this.
I mean, that's the way the jury went in this case. So let's just hope for the best for him and his mental illness. And hopefully he will get some of what he needs. I mean, this is really where people go out there and advocate for more help for people that need it, more mental health, more education. And I mean, I'm not sure if any of that will help if someone's in prison. Are there things that you could actually do that will change what happens in prison?
Well, I think it's the same three steps that we talked about when we were discussing the drug overdose crisis that the United States and really the world has experienced. Number one, vote. Your state governor here in Ohio governs the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Corrections and can install a director of that agency that has a rehabilitation mindset. So vote, advocate. You can go to local organizations, probation departments, your Board of Mental Health. You can go to the governor's office. You can petition the Department of Rehabilitation and Corrections to focus on mental health in prisons and in institutions. And then, of course, again, support. There are a variety of programs that allow non-incarcerated individuals to go into the prison system to provide support services. Everything from, drug addiction meetings to group therapy for a variety of reasons. These are all options that are available, and I would encourage people to get involved. That's what makes this world a better place.
And I think it does wonders for them. I had a friend who was a psychologist, and she used to go in and do drama classes that were around therapy for men who had committed sex crimes and hate crimes. And, sometimes they would have to act out what they did. And, she saw a lot of breakthroughs in that.
Reenacting in a safe and controlled environment can be a very powerful tool for personal development. So yeah, I'm glad she's doing that. With that, Erica, let's turn to our featured topic this week. The Constitution's Bill of Rights guarantees individual liberties, but how are those rights protected? How are the rules enforced? Well, one powerful mechanism for enforcing the restrictions on the government that the Fourth Amendment provides is the judicially created concept of the exclusionary rule. Erica, let's talk this week about the exclusionary rule.
Well, I love to start with a simple definition. What is the exclusionary rule, Brian?
The exclusionary rule prevents evidence that's collected in violation of the accused's constitutional rights from being used in court. So when you talk about Bill Cosby's case, the exclusionary rule there is being applied to the Fifth Amendment. You are not allowed to use his statements because you collected them in violation of his Fifth Amendment rights. It's grounded in the Fourth Amendment. It originated out of Fourth Amendment decisions in the Bill of Rights, and it's intended to protect people from illegal searches and seizures. That was its origin, and it's been expanded to a variety of constitutional protections. It provides a remedy. It provides a way for the average person to keep police and prosecutors in check. It also protects the Sixth Amendment right guarantee to counsel, and as we discussed, the Fifth Amendment right to remain silent.
I mean, it sounds like a great rule. I know that certain laws and rules and exceptions, they change over time. Have you seen any changes over time in this exclusionary rule?
Well, if we go back to its original origins, it was in part a reaction to the English law of general warrant and writs of assistance. So the English requirements that, or the English privilege, I guess, first, that law enforcement or soldiers could access your personal belongings, and then the writ of assistance that people had to help out a law enforcement officer under the crown at their initial command. So in 1789, the exclusionary rule was expanded, and based on members of the Supreme Court who were interpreting particular situations and how it was applied in particular circumstances. Everybody, well, I shouldn't say everybody, but a lot of people are really upset as to Bill Cosby getting out. And judges, even all the way back to the origins of this rule, have felt the same way. We are letting criminals go, and is that worth it? And judges have over and over again decided, yes, it is, because we have to have a way to hold the government accountable. And there's no better way to hold the government accountable than to let a guilty person go free and then go to the people and say, your government cheated. And because your government cheated, this guilty person is going free. Vote them out. This is why the vote is so powerful and so critical. Now, there's a distinction between the federal and the state application of the rule as well. Some states have laws that prevent the use of illegally collected evidence just on a statutory basis. But it wasn't until 1961, in a case called Mapp versus Ohio, that the Supreme Court made the exclusionary rule applicable to all 50 states through the 14th Amendment, which guarantees the federal due process rights to everybody under the state governments as well. So it wasn't until 1961 that even the states were using the exclusionary rule in, you really can't even call it a uniform fashion, but as close to a uniform fashion as we have today.
Wow, that is really interesting, and it's always interesting to see how these things change over time and what the community feels about it. So that makes a lot of sense. Can you tell us, the most important thing here is how can an accused person benefit from an exclusionary rule?
Well, if you hear that somebody got off on a technicality, as is the phrase frequently used with the Cosby case right now, that's probably because of an exercise of the exclusionary rule. Now, people say it's a technicality because the person is actually guilty. The crime was actually committed, but they're not going to be found guilty and they're not going to be punished for it. I say, Erica, it's not a technicality. This is how our system is designed to work. The government cannot cheat to win. And in cases where an illegal action is used by the police or the prosecution to gain an incriminating result, gain incriminating evidence, anything that comes from that illegal activity has to be excluded. I mean, I think the other option, Erica, is, all right, well, you violated, if a police officer conducts an illegal search, we say, well, you violated the Fourth Amendment, you broke the law. Are we now going to convict them of that illegal conduct and send them to jail? I don't think anybody's going to want that result. You as a prosecutor cheated to secure a conviction. So now you as a prosecutor have broken the laws of the Constitution, the most sacred of our laws. So you have to go to prison as the result of that. Now, I don't think anybody wants that result either. I think it's, when you think about it in those terms, holding the government accountable to following the rules and obeying the law, you understand that this isn't a legal technicality any more than the fact that you and I aren't allowed to steal from each other is a technicality. Remember, the state of nature, the way that human beings came up in the world, was that there were no rules. Life was nasty, brutish, short. And so we came together to form a society. And in that society, we started obeying rules. And I have rules to obey, and you have rules to obey. And the government has rules to obey. So When we apply the exclusionary rule, we are convicting the government and punishing them by saying, you can't use this evidence. Now, not every case that has evidence excluded results in an acquittal. There have been hundreds, thousands of cases where one piece of evidence is excluded from use, but the remainder of the case goes forward and the defendant is in fact convicted. The defense bar relentlessly challenges the accepted status of the exclusionary rule and constantly fights to protect it because it is the bulwark of the citizens from encroachment by the government. It is the last line of defense, protecting us from government overreach.
Well, yeah, and I think the problem is that for just regular people like me, I'm not a fancy criminal attorney, criminal defense attorney, but I know that when I watch shows on TV about crime, they glamorize it whenever the cops cheat to win. Oh, you're not supposed to steal the evidence from the locker so that this person gets the electric chair, whatever it is they're doing, but it's all the time. And I really never noticed it as much as I do now when I talk to you. And since I started talking to you every single time, you've ruined TV for me. But
You're welcome.
yes, thank you. But you are making society better. And it's unfortunate, but like I see the fake versions, but you're seeing the real versions every single day in court, which is why it's important that if somebody has a criminal matter in your area, that they come to you because you have the strategies and you have the passion. I mean, it's obvious that you're passionate about what you do, and I think that that's essential, along with the knowledge and the strategy to have in your defense when you are going to court for a criminal matter.
Well, I appreciate you saying that, Erica. Thank you for those kind words. Thank you for engaging in this discussion today. And to everybody who listened to our podcast and hears us week in and week out, to stay abreast of the latest developments in the biggest cases in pop culture, holding the police and the government accountable, understanding your Fourth Amendment rights, your Fifth Amendment rights, your Sixth Amendment rights, and how those rights are protected by the exclusionary rule, and all of your civil rights. Look to the law office of brianjones.com. Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/Central Ohio Criminal Defense, and on TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter at TLOBJ. We'll be back next week with a sui generis perspective on the next big thing in civil rights and criminal injustice system news, as well as a discussion of the difference between your Fifth and your Sixth Amendment rights under the Bill of Rights. Erica, my grandfather always told me when we parted ways, don't do anything I wouldn't do, kid. And to that, when I part ways with my friends, I add, if you do and you get caught, call me. I'll defend your rights as I'd want mine defended.